That translates not only for your personal statement, for the reader, but also for the interview as well. Application Renovation, Season 4, Episode 19. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I am wonderful. I'm excited to chat with you to learn about your application, see what went well, what went wrong potentially, and see where we can improve moving forward. Sound good?
Awesome.
Awesome. Something I don't talk a lot about on application renovation at all is if you want your application looked at, but you don't want to come on YouTube to have it looked at, go to mapped.com/services. We have a whole team of advisors, including 2 as of July 2022, former directors of admissions at medical schools. So check that out. All right, let's start with the nuts and bolts of your application. First of all, is this first application cycle? How many interviews? What did that look like?
Yeah, so this is my first application cycle. I got an interview late in the season, so probably around February, and then I got put on a wait list. And so that's kind of how it looked like for me.
Okay, so first application cycle, a February interview, and then waitlisted. So potentially, do you know if you were interviewed for a waitlist spot?
They didn't specify particularly. What admissions told me is that every interview or every interview pool that they have coming in are applying for slots or vying for slots.
Awesome. Okay. So where do you think you went wrong with your application? If anywhere.
So I do feel a little bit. So I have started the process of reapplying. So I revamped my personal statement completely. I think it was okay for what it was, but it could have been much improved and a little bit more story-like.
Yeah.
And I think there was little bits and pieces there between the personal statement activities where I felt like I could have probably improved a little bit.
Okay. Any big gaps in terms of clinical experience, any just huge red flags with stats, anything like that?
No, I think the only place where I majorly lack would be in terms of research.
Okay.
Besides doing a capstone project in undergrad, don't really have any hours in that.
All right. And research, if you've been following me at all, research is the one area where I'm that's not the reason you didn't get into med school. So let's go ahead and take a look at your application and see potentially some things that I see where you could have improved. And hopefully with the next application cycle, it'll be even better. Or you get off the wait list soon. And that, actually, let's talk about that. So as we're recording this, it is June, first week of June, 2022. Do you know wait list activity, where you are on the wait list? Is there any hope in the next month or two, depending on when your school starts, where you are waitlisted? Do you know? Have you been in contact with the school about that?
Yeah, so I have emailed. The only real response I've gotten is that it's a fluid pool of waitlists. They don't really rank. If they do rank, they don't tell students.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely sure where I am in the pool. I think historically for this school, waitlist movement goes around to mid-June until it really slows.
Okay.
So not sure.
Okay. So we don't know. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into your application and see what we see. Sound good?
Yep.
All right. So first thing I always look at, when did you apply? And you applied super early on, whether that was the first day or first couple days of the application cycle for 2021, 2022. Right off the bat, that's great. We applied early. No issues there. Demographic information, all redacted out. We have our languages, so speak a couple different languages. That's always a nice plus. We have disadvantage marked as no. SES disadvantage, which is the automatic calculation that the AAMC does, marked as no. No red flags, no military service. So a completely benign demographic information spot. Then we get to transcripts. And then we see some things going on here. We have one high school dual enrollment class, so no issues there. And then we get to your first round of freshman grades, and we see some B's, some B minuses, some A's. So a good mix of A's and B's. Obviously, we want as many A's as possible to keep that GPA up. Nothing huge. We see a nice run of A's going on here. Some passes, some more A's. And then we get to your GPA calculations, and we see starting off those B's really hitting your GPA freshman year with a 3.31, but then an upward trend since then, right? Going to a 3.6, 3.7, 4.0. Great. 3.63 overall, science overall, 3.73 cumulative with everything. So solid GPA, no issues for me there. We get an MCAT score. You've taken it one time. You took it in September. Why did you take it so early?
It just worked out for me schedule-wise.
Okay.
I think I was coming off of virtual classes and just had the summer before I started applying to work.
Okay, that makes sense. So 512 overall score. A lot of students would be concerned about that 125 Chem Phys. There's all this talk on SDN and Reddit about unbalanced MCAT scores. All of your other scores are 128 plus, with a lot of points coming from your Psych Soc section, which is exactly what you want to do. That's where the free points are. Not an issue, right? 512 is a great score. It's above the average for matriculants to medical school. So 512, not closing many doors for you. So stats, not an issue. Okay? So then we get to the experience descriptions. And for the most part, your experience descriptions are actually pretty good, if I remember correctly. I was looking at these last night to refresh myself, but we'll look one more time. We have primary care medical assistant. Why was there a focus on this primary care medical assistant versus just calling yourself a medical assistant?
Honestly, it's been a really long time since I filled this out. I changed it for my new application to just medical assistant. I think it was just trying to explain my role a little bit more and to say that I worked in a primary care clinic and not somewhere else.
Okay. The thing that stands out to me when I see that is agenda. Like, ooh, I'm really going to focus on letting you know that I'm really interested in primary care because I'm a primary care medical assistant. And so it just is one of those weird things. Like, nobody calls themselves like, I am a neurology medical assistant. Usually you're a medical assistant and you just happen to be in whatever practice you're in. So that was just the first thing. I'm like, what angles are we trying to take here? Obviously not a huge deal. Somebody's not going to look at this and go, oh my gosh, let's throw this application out. I wanted to know the thought process, because a lot of times it's the thought process behind what you're doing that usually leads the application astray. So when we look at here, for the most part, it's okay, right? We have some focus on your public health stuff that you're trying to throw in here. Public health, primary care, a lot of just description and understanding of what this role is for the experience description, the 700 characters that you get here. Not a big issue with that. And then we get to the most meaningful, and you have a patient story, which is great. The one thing when I read this patient story, number one is that I'm like, ooh, earwax. Like, do we really want to talk about earwax? For some reason, I'm on like earwax TikTok, where I get like all of the TikTok videos of people removing earwax. And I watch them. I don't know why. But it's like one of those things. It's like, is there maybe a better story than talking about impacted earwax? I don't know. But the one thing you see here that I wrote is that it's a story. I think there's too much focus on the patient and kind of just what is happening. And there's not much about you in this story, about you taking care of Dan, as you have written here, of you being compassionate towards Dan, of you, whatever, right? So it's a very common thing where students will, whether they're doing storytelling or they're just focused on an anecdote, not really storytelling, but trying to focus on other things, where there's too much focus on the patient And I get to the end and I'm like, well, who were you in this situation? How did you impact this patient? Get it? Earwax impact. So looking at it from that angle, I think I love that you tried to go for a story. I would have loved to see more about you in this situation. So we get to the next activity here, letter writer and artist. And so talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and finding this program to help alleviate loneliness that you have here. The first half of this activity is all about your grandmother, which obviously heartbreaking. Your grandmother passing of COVID early in the pandemic. I lost my grandfather earlier in the pandemic, right? Lots of grandparents were lost in the pandemic. It's very common, whether it's for COVID or for other activities, the student focusing on too much what led me to the activity versus talking about the activity. Right? These are activity descriptions, not what led me to the activity descriptions. So that's where, again, we get this sense of, for the application, I want to see you in this situation. And I get a lot about your grandmother, which led you to this situation. And then you have only a little bit left to kind of cram in what you did here. So just a style thing that I don't think a lot of students do, and I just don't think is necessary, of the whole backstory of what led people to specific activities. We get to volunteer discussion, facilitator, teacher. Teaching is a huge part of your application, whether it's through gymnastics or elsewhere. And again, we have, for the most part, kind of a general description here. I would love to see a little bit more about you, more about your impact here, other than kind of some numbers about leading 10 high school students through this. So for the most part, it's not terrible. It's not great. It's doing the job for the most part. I can understand kind of what you're doing, and a little bit about who you are. Just could be a little bit stronger to understand more. We get to awards. Great. Very easy to just list those, so that's perfect there. We get to volunteer middle and high school tutor. And these were good descriptions, right? It's just talking about what you're doing and telling these stories and the impact that you have here, building these connections, helping the students build those connections. So I thought this was good. It's interesting. It's not a ton of hours for how long it is, over 2 years. So that's a little bit of a question mark that I get when I see a most meaningful activity with not a lot of hours. And I go back to, what's your agenda here? So thinking about this one, why did you mark this one a most meaningful activity?
So this one was a little bit tricky for me. I actually worked with this organization previously in high school a ton. So it's most meaningful for me because I worked with a lot of these teachers and mentors and these types of students before. And it was something that I recently had gotten back into in the pandemic and really liked. And so it was meaningful to me, but it didn't have the hours to back it up. Okay.
So potentially, and I don't remember reading this, and maybe it's in there, potentially a sentence to say, right, the hours here don't incorporate the 300 hours I spent while I was in high school with the same organization, or something that kind of captures it in a way that kind of the rule of thumb is we don't include high school stuff. So maybe you could have included that, or just given a little bit of a nod that this wasn't your first time with the organization. We get shadowing, again, listing it like this, perfectly fine. Putting together the virtual shadowing with in-person shadowing, I think is perfectly fine to combine those two into one activity. And so we get to undergraduate instructional assistant. And so again, I put no you here, right? So we get to, my goal as this was to make sure I could facilitate a similar sense of enjoyment and passion, blah, 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 blah. And then really talking about just kind of in general what teaching tutoring is, right? I've always found teaching to be a two-way street. Still surprised when student question during office hours pushed me to view the topic in a new way. And for the most part, that's general description of what teaching is, what tutoring is, being pushed, learning new ways to facilitate information transfer, all of this fun stuff, right? And so I would love to see more about you and the impact and the impact of the role that you had here. We have here a big question mark that I had here. So this was about a year long, 300 hours, so part-time job, optometric assistant. And you said here you helped with every part of the patient's visit, from scheduling to performing imaging for eye conditions. Usually what I would try to do is just avoid the non-clinical stuff when you're talking about clinical experiences. So just talk about the clinical interactions. For the most part, good, right? You're focused on the story, and you also have this first sentence of kind of describing your role. So I think a lot of times students take my storytelling advice and they go too far. And it's a story and there's no reflection, there's no understanding of role. And so here you're like, well, optometric assistant, maybe they know what that does, but I'm just gonna let them know. I help them schedule, I help do imaging, I kind of do everything. And I'm like, okay, great. You spent maybe 100 characters on that, maybe a little bit less, and the rest you have for some anecdote and some reflection. So good job with that. Private tutor, again, good. You have a story of a student here. Tutor probably doesn't need a lot of time to spend telling the reader what a tutor does because it's a tutor. So good job with that one. ICU volunteer, you have this one listed as medical clinical, and I question this one because you say, I assisted the nurses with administrative tasks, answered basic visitor questions, and answered patient requests for more blankets or water. So I'm questioning what in there is the clinical experience. Maybe the very end where you're interacting, bringing blankets and water. And so I read this one, again, it's not a ton of hours, so it's like whatever. But maybe not clinical, maybe non-clinical. I don't know, but it's just every time I read and I'm like, well, is it not? It's just distracting me as the reviewer away from the goal of just understanding who you are. Friendship circle coach. And so we can see here we have coach, teaching tutoring assistant, teaching tutoring assistant, teaching tutoring assistant. There's a lot of you as a teacher in this, which is perfectly fine. Again, the applications should be a reflection of who you are. My assumption is that you didn't include these ones to force a narrative or an agenda or a theme around, ooh, I really love to teach. I think it's just who you are. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah. It's not like something that I chose with intention. It's just things I found fun.
Yeah.
And that ended up being most of my extracurricular activities.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine. All right, so when people talk about having a theme for an application, I don't think you need a theme. You just need to show who you are, and who you are is this theme, if you want to call it that. But I don't think it's a theme. I think it's just showing who you truly are. So we get to that friendship circle one, perfectly fine. And so we see a lot of activities. They're not a ton of hours, 20 hours, 90 hours, 60 hours, a 300-hour one, pretty good. 75, so-so. 70, which doesn't include the time as a high school student. And so potentially a question mark of you're doing these things, putting them on your application. Really, how important to you are they? Because it's not a lot of hours. And so that's a question going through my head again as I'm reading this. And so there's just, is this fluff? Is this not fluff? What's going on here? Again, 45 hours for these two different time periods. And this is physical therapy volunteer. So I wrote here, what is your role? What is the reflection? So you have memories of your own injury. You have Jill here despised having to ride the stationary bike. So a nice little story of interacting with Jill. But again, I want to know, what is your role as a physical therapy volunteer? What are you supposed to be doing? And then what is the reflection? What is the takeaway for this activity? And not necessarily like what did you learn or how this impacted your decision to pursue medicine, but just the reflection on this specific activity in a silo. We get to camp gymnastics counselor, some more of that role of being a teacher, being a leader, showing who you are, some better hours here, showing what's going on. We see some impact in terms of how many counselor or how many campers you have. So good job there. Founding member and fundraising chair of this gymnastics club that you started, or gymnastics team that you started in college. And so really interesting. I go back to, this is 1,000 hours. Gymnastics was kind of your life for a long time. And yet this wasn't a most meaningful. And this one that was 70 hours was. And so I come back to the question, and I'm not here to dictate what's meaningful to you or not. I'm here to question why you marked one thing meaningful and not something else, when to me, not just number of hours here, but looking at your personal statements, some of your secondaries, knowing a little bit more, but kind of behind the scenes, not what we're showing here, of who you are as a person, this to me seems like it should be a most meaningful to you as a person. Challenge me. Change my mind. I'm that meme sitting behind the table. This is a most meaningful. Change my mind.
Yeah, I struggle. I'm going to be really honest. I struggle with this for a very long time as to decide which one would be most meaningful, which one was not. I personally, for me, I do feel like gymnastics is a big part, and if I had more most meaningful activities, that would definitely be on there. I just didn't. I feel like personally felt like that's a lot of gymnastics to put as most meaningful. And I kind of wanted to show my personality beyond that. I spent so many years doing gymnastics, and that's like one of the first things people know about me, or like people find out about me. And it was really important to me to put out an application where that wasn't the sole focus.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. And I will tell you that line of thinking basically says, I want to manipulate the story that I'm going to put forward about who I am, because I'm afraid if I do too much about who I am, they're only going to see one side of me. You are a gymnastics nerd, if that's a thing, right? You are a gymnast.
It's true.
You have been in and around gymnastics as a gymnast, as a coach, as a counselor. You have done it all. That's who you are. Don't be afraid to show who you are. You don't have to mark something as most meaningful just to show a different part of who you are. Okay? My goal doing this is to have students really, really, really be comfortable being who they are, period. And then, yes, in that journey, I hope I see that some part of who you are is exploring healthcare and understanding what medicine is all about, and proving to yourself that you like being around patients, that you understand the doctor's role and can tell that story. And who are you big picture as a person? Because remember, the goal of the admissions committee is to put together a cohort of students with varying backgrounds and different interests and lots of diversity. And so you're a gymnast girl. That's who you are to the class. Hey, we need a gymnast girl. Right? Not just, hey, we need someone who has public health experience, right? So don't be afraid to show who you are. Now, yes, I understand that I'm like, hey, why isn't this a most meaningful experience? When your next one, gymnastics head coach, is marked as a most meaningful experience. So you're still comfortable marking something that's not clinical or not research or not shadowing as the most meaningful, which is great because a lot of students are scared to do that. So I'm glad that you marked some part of gymnastics as the most meaningful because that is your truth. And again, good. These were good. It shows me who you are. You have some impact in terms of number of people you're impacting here. So great job all around there. And then we get to your personal statement. And I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. We have personal statement. I hit the ground hard, searing pain shot up my arm just moments before, flying 10 feet through the air. So you have this nice little hook, this nice little story to begin with. And then I found out later in your secondary essay that this is kind of a lie. This is kind of a fabrication of your journey. Because in a secondary essay, it talks about a time when you were younger hurting your ankle, I believe it was, as kind of your first exposure to medicine. Why did you write about this in your personal statement and not the other activity, not the other injury, rather?
I just felt like this is a clearer shot, I feel like, to what I wanted. There was just so much time in between. And I know that you talk about this because I watch all your podcasts, and I know somewhere in there, that should have been my seed, per se, as my first introduction to healthcare. I think with the journey being as it was for me, this made a lot of sense for me to put as my seed.
Okay. All right.
As it may.
So you have an interaction with a physician with an injury, very common story for a seed. I just highlighted here, right? My eyes watered with this realization. She gently held my hand, right? Eyes watering to me doesn't convey crying or emotion. It's just like, oh, the sun is bright. My eyes are watering. So weird choice of words there. And I just wonder, why you chose watering versus my eyes filled with tears or something that conveys emotion.
I think maybe subconsciously it's a little hard to write about this event.
Yeah.
So maybe I stayed a little further away from emotions than I wanted to.
Okay.
And so that could be a reason.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Let's talk about the reflection, because to me, the reflection is the most important part. You had this experience, you're interacting with this physician. It's a big time in your life, a life-changing moment here where you're being told potentially your season's over and you're not going to compete again for a little while, and maybe forever, right? Whatever emotions are going through your head at that moment. And the reflection that you take away here is this instilled a desire in you to pursue a career where I can employ these values of compassion, I can't say that word, advocacy, and education to help others going through the same mentally and physically taxing journey. I read that and I go, I have no idea what you're trying to tell me. Are you trying to tell me you want to be a physician? That this kind of sparked a moment for you to explore medicine? It doesn't say that. You have these big fancy words here of compassion, advocacy, and education, things that you bring up again over and over. And I think your kind of stories that you picked are trying to highlight these different parts of this line here, and you bring it up again at the end. So we have the activity section where I think you did a decent job of just telling your truth and showing who you are. You didn't try to do any sort of sales pitch or push any sort of agenda. And then we get to the personal statement, and right off the bat, I'm like, uh-oh, we're going down a path of pushing some sort of agenda here of compassion and advocacy and education. And I don't know what you're trying to tell me here other than compassion, advocacy, and education are important to you. I don't know from this line that you want to be a doctor. So I'm going to keep reading. Hopefully we get a little bit stronger sentiment. We get early exposure to physical therapy and medicine showed me that each provides a support system during a person's rehabilitation process. Okay. I'm not sure why I'm reading about physical therapy here in your personal statement. I saw physical therapy volunteer in your activities section. Maybe I read that before your personal statement. Maybe I read your personal statement first. We don't really know, so you can't really play any sort of game there. But it seems like the physical therapy angle here is a distraction because you're using it as a launching point to say, hey, it seems like you're saying, I don't want to be a physical therapist. I want to be a doctor. Is that the angle you took here?
Yeah, I think, well, I know like in that point or after that event, I was kind of weighing between physical therapy and medicine. And I felt like that was a big part of my journey as well. And so that's what this part is.
How far down the physical therapy path did you get?
Not very far. I volunteered some, shadowed some, and then like took some general prereqs, but nothing fancy.
Potentially a distraction that we don't need for the personal statement, which is tell me why you want to be a doctor. And you're like, well, for a couple weeks I thought about physical therapy, and let me tell a physical therapy story to highlight that. And so you have this decision here, again, that just the story doesn't line up. This realization reaffirmed my decision to pursue medicine. Number one, I haven't heard where you have affirmed your desire to be a physician. And number two, if you're exploring physical therapy, how can you reaffirm a decision to pursue medicine versus it is confirming that you want to do medicine instead of physical therapy? So the reflection is just a little bit off in terms of the story. And so I'm still equally confused at this point of like, who are you? Why is medicine in your path, right? Why medicine? Which is, for me, the goal of the personal statement. To be as clear as possible. Here is my journey to where I am today. And so we have a little bit of this distraction to include physical therapy because you went down that path for a little bit and you're like, okay, I guess I should include it. I don't think you need it. And I think it kind of ruins the story a little bit because it's a distraction and the connections don't really make sense. And then we get to, okay, so we have, going back here, compassion, advocacy, education. Maybe this is compassion. I don't know. We clearly have an education paragraph here where you're a coach and you're using your skills to teach people. And you have here, being able to leverage education to help individuals achieve their goals and improve their quality of life is one of the reasons I want to become a physician. This is where you have the kind of theme that we didn't say is a theme of your activities being very much around teaching and education. And you're like, ooh, I need to use this as an angle of why I want to be a physician. But being an educator doesn't mean you're a physician. Being an educator doesn't mean you should be a physician. Being a physician doesn't mean you're an educator. I mean, it does, kind of. But when you try to use this angle of like, ooh, I want to be an educator, therefore I want to be a physician, to me, that's not a logical connection. And I just need super simple logical connections to go, okay, I understand your journey here. And I understand each part of this clearly makes sense as to why you want to be a doctor. Great. I love from the activity section all of the teaching and educating that you have because yes, as a physician, you're teaching and educating patients, nurses, PAs, NPs, families, medical students, residents, fellows. You're teaching everyone, right? Because you are at the top of supposedly the educational pyramid. So that, no doubt, that's a big part of being a physician. But when students try to make the connection, ooh, I like education, therefore I want to be a physician, and you just throw in the medical side of it of achieving their goals and improve their quality of life, it's just not a strong argument. And we get to this next paragraph. You become a medical assistant, and you have this interaction with Sarah, which is great. You're telling this story here. You don't have a lot of interaction here. So very similar kind of feedback to your activities section where a lot of your activities missed you. And it was a lot about the patient. It was a lot about the doctor, a lot about just the stuff going on. This is another example of this where really the only interaction that I saw here was this kind of, you held her hand, you felt helpless, realized I did not have the knowledge to understand why she was suffering. So that to me is like the interaction there of what you saw. And then I've been on a mission lately for this feeling helpless, not having knowledge. If you're telling me you want to be a physician and you're a medical assistant, of course you don't have the knowledge. Or that's kind of obvious. This is a stepping stone for you to get to school where you gain the knowledge. And so I'm trying to have students really focus on less on not having knowledge, less on I wasn't able to do enough, because those are obvious results of being in a job as a stepping stone to what you want to do. So just helping students flush that out a little bit more. So we get to the takeaway here, and you have this responsibility both humbled and inspired me to continue on my journey to become a physician, to reassure, treat, and ease people suffering on many levels and in the most dire situations. Okay, it's a decent reflection, right? Focusing on why this impacted you and what you want to do. And then we get to conclusion paragraph. You don't want to just heal physical pain, but emotional suffering as well. You have some kind of aspirational stuff, partner with patients to ensure they're able to live their lives to their fullest, fulfill their passions. So decent conclusion here in terms of aspirations and going big and what you want to accomplish, bringing back in this educator, advocate, healer angle, which is a little bit, I was trying to force in, okay, education here, maybe this is the compassion one, maybe this is the healer one, I'm not sure. If you were trying to make this a theme of your personal statement, you didn't really do it. And then it's different too, because you have advocate, educator, advocate, and healer. But then up here you have compassion, advocacy, education. So you switched out one of them. And so I'm like, oh, did you forget the three that you were most focused on? Unless compassion and healer are synonymous. So I was just a little confused with that. And this, I don't think students need to do that kind of stuff in terms of having these fancy callbacks and other things. So I get to the end of your personal statement and I go, okay, do I know why you're here? I do a little bit. I understand that you hurt yourself in gymnastics that potentially led to you wanting to be a physician, although you don't really say that. And then you're exploring physical therapy, and I'm confused why you're exploring physical therapy if you were just trying to tell me that your injury led you to want to be a physician, so I'm confused there. Or maybe you were vague up here because it was like, well, I was kind of between physical therapy and physician, so I didn't want to say physician because I need to talk about physical therapy. And so maybe that was part of your thought process on why you were a little bit more vague here. And we have the education piece that for me doesn't really fit with a personal statement. And so I'm like, well, you've kind of done all of the right things in terms of exploring healthcare and doing these things. I'm a little confused at this point. And so that's, I think, potentially where your story fell apart a little bit in terms of just helping me understand who you are. In terms of medical schools, because Reddit thinks everything is about the school list, we have Albany, which is a private school, I think. Columbia, obviously, great private school. Drexel's private. EVMS, I believe, is private. I forget if EVMS is. Netter private, GW private. So lots of private schools, which is great. A good range of schools in terms of like not all like super prestigious institutions. So I think a really good job with your school list. Obviously lots of California schools. I think you're a California resident. A couple public out-of-state schools. Michigan, obviously very out-of-state friendly. So school list, I don't think is an issue. And so I think it's really at the end of the day, the story came down to just a little bit of confusion about who you are and what this journey is.
A lot of the things you brought up in my personal statement, reading it back after like 8 months were some of the questions I brought up myself. Like the education paragraph didn't make sense to me anymore. The reflection for the first paragraph, I like understood that I was trying to be vague because the truth was I wasn't really sure beyond I want to go into healthcare exactly what type of field I wanted. So I was between like physical therapy and medicine, actually. And I think this is a lot of the changes I made into the stuff I put into my application this time around, which is
great.
Helpful to be validated.
Good. And in terms of experiences, so you have all of your gymnastics stuff from before. Let's go up to the top. You have the medical assistant stuff that you said you were going to keep doing. Are you still doing that?
Yeah, I'm still working full time.
Great. Okay, so you're still working as a medical assistant, getting clinical experience. What about shadowing? Are you still getting some shadowing?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Now, you mentioned you shadowed a physical therapist. Why didn't you put physical therapy shadowing in here?
Mm-hmm. I was confused as to whether that would necessarily be relevant. I personally had never seen anybody put any physical therapist shadowing in their shadowing section.
Oh, yeah.
So I just left it out.
Okay.
And so I left it out of those physical therapy volunteer hours as well. So a lot of those hours that are not in that section, I did spend a lot of time in that clinic, just not volunteering all the time.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to put physical therapy shadowing, PA shadowing, NP shadowing, chiropractic shadowing, optometry shadowing. That shows the reviewer that you're out exploring and what you're doing. So yes, you should have a lot, or enough rather, physician shadowing, MDDO physician shadowing, and it shouldn't be overpowered with, I have 10 hours of physician shadowing and 300 hours of physical therapy shadowing. That's going to look a little bit weird. But I think you can put physical therapy shadowing in your activity section. I've seen it a bunch, and it's not a problem. Any other questions?
Yeah. No, I don't think so.
Well, hopefully this was helpful for you. Gave you some confidence that you were on the right path with your new application. You, stat-wise, I think are perfectly fine. You don't need to worry about that unbalanced MCAT score that everyone is always worried about. Your GPA is good. Your activities are pretty strong, and you've done a good job telling your story. I think the story that needs the best work, the most work, is that story about why you want to be a doctor. Because that translates not only for your personal statement, for the reader, but also for the interview as well. My assumption is you got asked on your interview, unless it was a strict MMI, you got asked, why do you want to be a doctor? So that'll help you with your interview as well, just solidifying that story. So good luck, fingers crossed, and hopefully we hear good news from you moving forward with this new application cycle.